Something that is discussed to death on YouTube, for understandable reasons, are the war goals of the major Axis powers, with German dreams of continental hegemony, Italian dreams of a neo-Roman empire, and the Japanese hopes for a Japanese-dominated co-prosperity sphere in Asia and the Pacific. But one thing little talked about are the territorial goals of the minor powers that found themselves aligned with the Axis. That is something I aim to explore today. Before we dive in though, the reason for most of these nations to join the Axis went beyond simple warmongering motivations, as all of these states were, by definition, minor, finding themselves on a continent dominated by the Axis powers. This does not at all excuse their roles in World War II, but I do want it to be clear that there are deeper political, military, diplomatic, and economic factors behind their joining World War II. Factors I intend to explore in a later video. Now the first nation I want to explore is Hungary. Their territorial goals can easily be summarized. The restoration of as much of St. Stephen's crown as possible. In other words, a restoration of their pre-World War I borders. Borders which, for the most part, had been under Hungarian hegemony for the better part of a millennia, ever since their invasion of Pannonia. Yet, in the aftermath of Hungary's participation in World War I, these borders were broken up. Romania would annex Transylvania, Croatia, Vojvodina and Banat were all seized by Yugoslavia, while Czechoslovakia would be formed, taking with it Carpatho-Ukraine and southern Slovakia. Even Austria, a fellow Central Power, would end up taking minor territories away from the Hungarians. So, quite simply put, the restoration of this was pretty much the extent of what Hungary hoped for. Of course, there is some nuance to this. Most of the territories Hungary had occupied were far from Hungarian majority. This would greatly impact the priorities of these reconquests. Territories like southern Slovakia, Vojvodina, and parts of Transylvania held priority over a hypothetical reconquest of a region like Croatia. So let's recognize this loose priority for Hungarian majority territories, as well as the territories needed to reach them, while especially things like a reconquest of Croatia being very far-fetched long-term goals. Now beyond these initial priorities, the simple shifting of European geopolitics would have to alter Hungarian ambitions. The full restoration of these borders were always the goal, but after the German annexation of Austria, hopes for a reconquest of Burgenland mostly disappeared. Hungary continued claiming the territory, but Germany had no intention of ever giving it up. And as Hungary became economically dependent on Germany, the question of the Burgenland was practically given up on. Shortly afterwards, the Germans would successfully gain the Sudetenland, setting in motion the collapse of Czechoslovakia. In this, Germany would support a Hungarian annexation of southern Slovakia. This would signify the first territories Hungary successfully regained. Shortly afterwards, the Germans would support a Slovak uprising, causing the full destruction of Czechoslovakia. Hungary would use this chaos to annex Carpatho-Ukraine and move the border with Slovakia to the west, thereby achieving yet more of their goals. Yet, at the same time, German recognition and support for the new Slovak state would mean that further reconquests to the north were now generally off the table. From here, Hungary began exerting pressure on Romania, hoping to seize the entirety of Transylvania. By this point though, Germany had defeated France, and they sought to prevent a conflict in the region. Germany and Italy would jointly intervene and decided to award a sizable chunk of Transylvania to the Hungarians, specifically the parts which included most of the Hungarians of the territory. This once more settled a major portion of Hungarian desires towards the east. Hungary continued to hope for more, but as both nations now entered the Axis, dreams of further Transylvania expansion was halted. This leaves their final expansion after the invasion of Yugoslavia by the Axis. Upon the nation's partition, Hungary would receive Vojvodina and a minor part of Slovakia. This final expansion had practically caused most Hungarians to again be unified into this single state. Yet, further Hungarian gains were again made impossible, as Croatia was set up as an Axis puppet and the German puppet of Serbia retained Banat as an autonomous region. This region was claimed by German nationalists living there, Hungary, and even Romania. To circumvent conflict, the Germans kept it with Serbia for now, though it was pretty clear that there were no plans to hand it over to Hungary. So that concludes the Hungarian portions. These were their pre-war borders, this is what they, in a maximalist sense, had hoped for, and this is what they actually ended up looking like during the war. Of course, though, in the aftermath of World War II, their borders returned to exactly what they were before the conflict. Now Romania is slightly more complicated. In the aftermath of World War I, they actually ended up with pretty much all the territory that they ever claimed. These borders becoming known as Greater Romania. Sure, fringe nationalists had hopes for a couple more territories, but for the most part, Romania was content with their borders. But after 1938, this would swiftly start to change. Romania was part of an alliance called the Little Entente, a French alliance sphere to protect Eastern Europe from a rebound of Central Power nations. Beyond that, Romania was also allied to the Poles. Now, we see in 1938 the Czechs be partitioned by the Germans. The Poles would then get invaded, and the French, now the final bastion against the Germans, would shock the world by collapsing too. Romania had suddenly become very alone in this world. Due to this weakness, the Soviets seized Moldova, Hungary seized northern Transylvania, and Bulgaria seized southern Dobruja. Territorially put, the reclamation of these territories was Romania's main motivation during the war, with only minor calls for expansion elsewhere. So, did they succeed? Not really. Romania enthusiastically joined the invasion of the Soviet Union, thereby regaining Moldova and Bukovina. Even more, the Germans awarded the Romanians all of this territory, known as Transnistria, in order to compensate for the loss of northern Transylvania. But, you might have noticed, this wasn't territory Romania cared very much about, so of course, they might as well keep it. Romania's primary reason for their great participation in Barbarossa wasn't expansion into Ukraine. Rather, it was in preparation for a German-dominated world. Romania had hoped that their great participation would mean Germany either forces Hungary to return northern Transylvania or allow Romania to go to war over it. As far as we know though, Germany had no such plans, and for now, the territory was seemingly permanently lost. Southern Dobruja then was territory Romania cared far less about. Of course, they wanted it back, but compared to Transylvania or Moldova, it was less big, less valuable, and the population was far less Romanian. When the territory had been taken over by Bulgaria, much of Romania's population had already been removed. Considering the lack of importance of the region and Bulgaria's alliance with Germany, southern Dobruja was mostly given up on. That just leaves their minor claim on Banat, which we already discussed with Hungary, but Germany, Hungary and Romania had all wanted the territory, but much like with Hungary, there was little shot of Romania ever gaining it. So, to conclude, these were Romania's borders before their participation in World War II. These were the return to post-World War I borders which Romania desired, between which southern Dobruja was the least important. They might have also wanted Banat too. During the war, Romania actually got Moldova and Bukovina back and got Transnistria too. But when World War II ended in a loss, Romania would permanently lose the territories previously taken by the Soviets and Bulgarians, though northern Transylvania was returned. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. That moves us to Bulgaria, a nation which had a rough few decades prior. Subjugated by the Ottomans for centuries, they had hoped for roughly this upon their independence. They would only get this. Later, they teamed up with other Balkan powers against the Ottomans. Once more, they had hoped for all of this, but ended up with significantly less. Upset, they started a war with their former allies, which became a disaster as all of their neighbors teamed up against them. Once more, Bulgaria would see their lands reduced. Even worse, Bulgaria then joined the losing side of World War I, and, you'll never guess, they lost yet more territories in the treaty. The lead-up to World War II presented Bulgaria with options for expansion, with broadly 3 directions considered. First, the immediate Aegean coast, partially due to the Bulgarians living there, but more for the naval options it would give the nation. Second, Dobruja, partially due to historical reasons, partially to control the entrance to the Danube, but mostly due to Bulgarian populations in southern Dobruja. Finally, to the west, Bulgaria hoped to annex Macedonia, a people practically Bulgarian. These were their primary goals, while further expansion into southern Macedonia and potentially eastern Serbia also being considered. But despite war breaking out in Europe, Bulgaria never had an intention to participate in a great war of reconquest. Rather, they had hoped to play the West, the Axis, and the Soviets against each other for their own benefit. This was very briefly successful, as Bulgaria peacefully got southern Dobruja, their first territorial expansion. But Bulgarian neutrality was not to be. As Italy faltered in Greece, Germany would force Bulgaria into the Axis. Territorially, this was beneficial for Bulgaria, as most of Western Thrace would come under Bulgarian control, except for this borderland, which Germany would keep in the case of a Turkish alliance with Britain. This already satisfied quite a chunk of Bulgaria's ambition, and the minor border strip would likely pass to Bulgaria post-war. Against Yugoslavia, Bulgaria likewise got pretty much most of their immediate claims, though Italy occupied parts of Western Macedonia, which Bulgaria might have wanted. This already basically satisfied every major goal of Bulgaria. Beyond this though, Italian and German positions in Serbia and Albania dashed hopes of westward expansion. Germany had also occupied Thessaloniki, planning to annex it for themselves, meaning Bulgaria wouldn't be able to expand there. Likewise, for as long as Romania remained a useful German ally, further expansion into Dobruja seemed unlikely. So, in conclusion, this was Bulgaria before World War II, with roughly this being what they hoped to achieve, with obviously greater emphasis on nearby Bulgarian majority territory. This is what Bulgaria actually achieved during the conflict, and despite their loss, Bulgaria, uniquely, actually managed to keep some territories post-war, as their annexation of southern Dobruja was confirmed. This moves us to Finland, whose place amongst the Axis powers was decisively to combat the Soviet Union. They had been relatively content with their post-independence borders, but would find themselves invaded by the Soviets in 1940, forced to give up significant territories. Obviously, the reclamation of said territories would be key. In fact, officially, these territories were the only goals for Finland. In practice though, at least the integration of East Karelia was also desired, as the Karelian peoples had sought integration into Finland ever since their independence. Even more, a slogan was taking hold in Finland: shorter borders, longer peace. This basically called for an annexation of this territory, thereby creating a far more defendable front line with only 3 chokeholds to hold, rather than the huge border of our timeline. The Kola territory in the north, which would now be isolated, would probably then also be taken for convenience. Now there is limited evidence that Germany might have also awarded Leningrad to the Finns, but there is little evidence that Finland had much interest beyond minor adjustments of the border there. Similarly, there were vague dreams of a Greater Finland by nationalists, who dreamt of borders including all of Ingria and even Estonia, if not just all of northern Russia. But aside from these dreams being extremely unrealistic, the Finnish government did not seem to be very receptive to these concepts. Rather, this seems to comprise most of the serious goals for the Finnish government. So, did Finland achieve these? Partially, yes. While the Germans were rolling over Russia, Finland not just reclaimed their lost territory due to the Winter War, thereby achieving their primary war aims, they were also able to occupy most of eastern Karelia, practically achieving their secondary goal, unification with the Karelians. From here though, the war stalemated. Soviet victory at Stalingrad shocked Finland, and they tried leaving the war. It had now become very clear that the shorter border, longer peace borders were unattainable. As the Soviets beat back the Germans and the Finns in 1944, Finland would negotiate their surrender. So, in conclusion, these were Finland's borders before joining World War II. This is pretty much what they realistically hoped for. This is basically what they achieved during the war, and when Finland dropped from the conflict, they further lost these territories. In total, having lost all of this between 1939 and 1945. This leads us to the final minor Axis power, Thailand. Like most nations discussed, their desires can basically be summed up as regain territories once lost. Specifically, territory in three directions. First, to the south, where these regions were taken by Britain in 1909. To the west, these lands had been taken by British Burma. And finally, all of this had been taken by France over the past century. The broad reclamation of most of these borders pretty much represented the maximum extent of Thai goals. But, as always, geopolitics, nationalism, and circumstance influenced the priorities. Most of Cambodia had been seized 80 years ago, and its reclamation was considered rather unlikely. Beyond that, Cambodians were a different ethnic group to the Thai, which mattered a lot to the nationalist regime. Beyond that, the reclamation of most of the deeper Laotian territory lost to France was considered very ambitious, with more focus laying on the more minor and recent border losses. Finally, and this represents some real extremes, the unification of the southwestern Thai people in Burma and China might have also been sought after, though obviously the chance for this was very minor. Now all of this was put into motion after the fall of France in Europe. Much like Bulgaria, Thailand had no plans for a grand conflict with the West, and Japan didn't immediately let them in on their plans either. Thailand had been very fearful of a direct war with Britain, yet with France occupied, a non-aggression pact with Britain secured, and relations with Japan positive, Thailand mustered an invasion of Indochina, after which Japan arbitrated an end to the conflict, where Thailand did indeed get their immediate border claims, while the rest of Indochina would increasingly fall under Japanese hegemony. So, Thailand had successfully settled the first conflicted borders, but the Japanese had absolutely no intention to let them get more of Indochina. This would also be the furthest extent of Thai gains while neutral. The day after Pearl Harbor, Japan would launch an invasion of Thailand. The Thais considered resisting, but soon gave up, allowing the Japanese access through their land, which Japan used to achieve further gains in Southeast Asia. Now that it seemed likely that Japan would win the war, Thailand signed a full alliance with Japan. In exchange, parts of Malaya and Burma were transferred to Thailand as well. All of this basically satisfied most of Thailand's immediate gains, with further expansion into Burma still on the table had Japan won the war, which of course they did not. So, this is Thailand before entering the war, with these being the territories they mostly hoped to end up with. During the conflict, they managed to achieve these borders, but after the defeat of Japan, they were forced to return to their pre-war borders. With that, we have discussed all that I wanted to discuss. Thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.